40 trainee surgeons picked up a scalpel, performed a full operation, then rated their own performance. The worst group gave themselves a 5.11 out of 10. Experts watching the same footage scored them 3.77. That gap between what you think you're doing and what you're actually doing is the most dangerous blind spot in the human brain. And by the end of this video, you'll know exactly where it lives in you. Picture the operating room. The air smells like antiseptic and recycled cold. The lights overhead are brutal and white, the kind that flatten every shadow. You're one of those 40 residents. Your gloves are tight against your knuckles. You've trained for this. You feel ready. You have absolutely no idea what you don't know. The procedure is laparoscopic surgery, small incisions, a camera threaded inside, instruments guided by a screen. Precise, technical, unforgiving. These residents performed it on a pig model, a standard training tool. Then they filled out a self-assessment form, and what they wrote down should make your stomach drop. But first, why does this happen to anyone at all? Here's the brutal mechanic. To accurately judge your own skill, you need the same mental tools required to perform that skill expertly. Think about that. The knowledge that would tell you you're doing it wrong is the exact knowledge you haven't built yet. You're using a broken ruler to measure whether the ruler is broken. Psychologists David Dunning and Dunning-Kruger proved this in 1999. They tested students on logic, grammar, and humor. The lowest performers wildly overestimated themselves. Not slightly, they placed themselves in the 62nd percentile on average. Their actual score? 12th. That's not arrogance. That's a structural failure of the brain's self-monitoring system. You feel this in your own life, even if you've never named it. The presentation you gave that you thought went beautifully until you watched the recording. The conversation you replayed convinced you'd made your point, only to learn the other person heard something completely different. That queasy dissonance. That's the gap. That gap has a mechanism. Back to the operating room. The camera footage from the pig surgery was reviewed by expert surgeons, people with thousands of hours of laparoscopic experience. They used a validated scoring tool called GOALS, Global Operative Assessment of Laparoscopic Skills. Every movement rated. Every instrument position judged. Cold, precise, ruthless in its clarity. The residents who scored lowest on objective performance, the ones the experts ranked poorest, gave themselves the highest self-assessments relative to their actual ability. They didn't just misjudge themselves a little. They misjudged themselves the most. And here's what makes this genuinely terrifying. The better the residents got, the more accurately they could see their own flaws. Stay with me, because what the data reveals about the top performers might be the most useful thing you hear today. The high performers underestimated themselves. They watched their own footage and noticed every wobble of the instrument, every half-second of hesitation. They felt worse about their performance than they should have. The experts looked at the same footage and scored them significantly higher. Competence doesn't inflate your ego, it quietly deflates it. This is called the dual burden of incompetence. You lack the skill, and you lack the ability to detect that you lack the skill. Two deficits stacked. Meanwhile, the expert carries a different weight, the burden of knowing exactly how much can go wrong. Every sip of their morning coffee is shadowed by the 10 ways today's procedure could get complicated. Feel that asymmetry in your chest. The beginner walks in loose-shouldered, almost casual. The master walks in carrying invisible weight. And here's the maddening part. From the outside, the beginner looks more confident. Confidence reads as competence to most human brains. We're wired to follow the person who doesn't hesitate, even when hesitation would be the smarter response. This has consequences that reach far beyond operating rooms. It touches every room where humans make decisions. The job candidate who overstates their expertise in the interview. The manager who can't diagnose what's broken in their team because they can't see the skill gap in themselves. The driver who's convinced they're above average. Statistically, most of them can't be right. Studies consistently show that roughly 80 to 93% of drivers rate themselves as above average. The math is impossible. Half of all drivers, by definition, are below the median. But the brain doesn't hand you a comparative data set. It hands you your own experience, filtered through your own perception, graded by your own rubric, and it feels completely objective. Here's what I want you to sit with. This isn't a flaw in bad people. It's not stupidity. It's not weakness of character. It is the default factory setting of the human brain, and it was almost certainly running in you this morning. In a moment, I'll show you the exact cognitive mechanism responsible. But first, you need to understand where it breaks down most dangerously. The mechanism has a name. It's called metacognitive deficiency, the inability to think accurately about your own thinking. Most of us walk around believing our internal self-assessments are roughly calibrated to reality. They are not. They're built from familiarity, from repetition, from the feeling of fluency. And fluency is a liar. Here's what fluency feels like. You read something, and it makes sense. The words flow in. You think, I understand this. But understanding and retention are completely different sensations inside the brain. You feel the same whether information has truly integrated or merely skimmed the surface. The sensation of knowing doesn't tell you how deep the knowing goes. And this is where the biggest reveal lies, the actual cognitive event that creates the Dunning-Kruger gap in real time, in your brain, right now. But before I name it, you need to understand one more layer of what the surgeons showed us. Because without this piece, the solution won't stick. And the solution is specific. And it will change how you think about yourself by the time this video ends. The surgical residents were given their expert scores afterward. When low performers saw the gap between their self-rating and the expert rating, many of them pushed back. They questioned the scoring system. They remembered details the experts hadn't seen. They constructed a defense. The brain, when confronted with evidence of its own error, often argues, loudly, internally. This is called motivated reasoning, and it's the immune system of the ego. When data threatens your self-image, the brain deploys antibodies, doubt about the source, alternative interpretations, selective memory. You've done this. So have I. The question isn't whether it happens. The question is, can you catch it in the act before it finishes defending you? Now the mechanism. The Dunning-Kruger blind spot is created by a single cognitive move your brain makes constantly, automatically, without announcing itself. It's called assimilation bias, the tendency to evaluate new experiences through the framework of what you already know. You take in new information and immediately map it onto familiar terrain. What doesn't fit gets smoothed over. For the surgical resident, every unfamiliar instrument movement got mapped to the closest familiar motion they already knew. The brain said, close enough. The expert's eye said, not close enough. The resident felt competent because the motion felt familiar. Familiarity and precision are not the same thing, but inside your nervous system, they feel identical. You can feel this right now if you try. Think of a skill you believe you're solid at. Maybe it's public speaking or writing or reading people in a room. Now ask yourself, when did someone who was genuinely better than you last evaluate your performance? And what did they actually say? Not what you chose to hear. What did they say? That moment of honest recall is uncomfortable. Good. Discomfort is the nervous system registering a gap between what it believed and what is actually true. Most people flinch away from that discomfort and call it humility. Real humility isn't flinching. Real humility is staying in the feeling long enough to read what it's telling you. Here's the move that makes that possible. The highest performing surgical residents had one thing in common beyond their technical scores. They sought external feedback before they formed their self-assessment. They watched the footage before they filled out the form. They let reality speak first. They hadn't yet given the brain the chance to construct a comfortable story about what had just happened. That sequence matters enormously. First impression, then self-assessment, that's the trap. Reality first, self-assessment second, that's the correction. It sounds simple. It is brutally difficult to do in practice because the brain begins generating its self-story the moment you walk out of the room. By the time you're asked to rate yourself, the narrative is already written. So how do you interrupt it? You stop asking yourself, how did I do? Because your brain will answer that question using the broken ruler. Instead you ask, what would someone with more skill have noticed that I might have missed? It's a different question. It forces the brain to model a perspective outside its own current competence level. That question creates cognitive distance. It separates you from your performance long enough to see it rather than simply remember it. Athletes use film review this way. Surgeons who improve fastest use structured external feedback before self-assessment. The question works because it doesn't ask you to know more than you know. It asks you to imagine a position you haven't reached yet. The residents who improved most between their first and second surgical assessments were not the ones who felt worst about themselves. They were the ones who could accurately describe the gap between their current performance and the performance they were aiming for. They could name the distance. Naming the distance is the beginning of closing it. 40 trainee surgeons. A 5.11 versus a 3.77. That gap was never about talent. It was about the brain doing exactly what it was built to do. Protect your confidence using the only information it has access to, which is itself. The blind spot lives wherever you stopped asking for a view from outside your own head. So here's your question. Right now, one skill you're relying on most in your life. When did someone genuinely more skilled than you last tell you what they actually saw? Drop your answer in the comments. I'll be reading every single one.